If I had to retitle this and be more specific, it would be understanding domestic animal issues in getting prescribed grazing applied on rangelands. Because I always have to almost change hats when I talk about pasture lands because the grazing management is so different. So my comments today are in that context, domestic animal issues with getting prescribed grazing applied on rangelands. So, I've already told you earlier this week how much I thought of the working effectively with livestock producers training that NRCS puts on, and then I got a chance to take it when it was 2 weeks long early in my career at Texas Christian University. I started writing down most of these ideas the year I got back from this training. Okay, and some of you are going to recognize a lot of the things that I talk about. You'll run into them too while you've been working conservation plans. I hope to have enough time at the end to solicit a few more ideas from the room, because I'm sure I haven't been all inclusive. But the idea here is that if prescribed grazing plan is going to happen, it has to be practical, it has to be feasible, it has to fit in to the ranching operation. We really can't turn a blind eye to that aspect. There's quite a bit to think about along those lines. And so I'm trying to specifically describe some of the considerations and constraints that I've observed, that I've learned about, and that I've heard of from other people when designing grazing plans. So here's one idea to kind of set this up too. Okay, I have a talk about prescribed grazing and grazing management that I give in my state over and over to new employees and partners and people who want to cross-train into range. And this slide is from that presentation. And the idea we're conveying here is that when you're looking at designing prescribed grazing, the complexities start to layer on. And you start out, well, imagine a brand new graduate from a range school who has a basic understanding of the physiological needs of plants and the plants' responses to grazing and the plants that are out there and growth curves and what needs to happen in order to take care of that plant community in grazing management. And they can sit down with a map and a piece of paper and a little bit of knowledge of the plants that are growing out there and map out and say, okay, if we just, graze during these times and rest during these times, everything's going to be taken care of. It's pretty easy, easier than falling off a log. It's just like, ducks swimming on a pond. Cattle are going to be grazing in the pasture. So it's pretty easy to set that up at the outset if you're just working by yourself. So if you want to go fast, go by yourself. But if you want to go far, you need to start taking into some more considerations. You want to reduce the rebiting of individual plants. You want to minimize the effects of grazing forage plants during that most vulnerable stage in their life cycle. You want to increase opportunities for the seed production to happen. You want to decrease selective grazing. So you maybe add a few more tweaks to your grazing plan to try to make some of these things happen. Okay, now you're done. Now you're happy. And then some other people come in and they say, well, don't forget about the hydrologic cycle. We want to do whatever we can do to make sure that all the rain that hits the ground will go into the ground. So whatever you're doing with your grazing system, make sure that happens. Oh, and you got a riparian area there. That is going to need some special consideration, a special little wetland area maybe. So deal with that. And then the pollinators, we understand that you're paying attention to the responses of grazing of the plants and their physiological needs, but what about ensuring that there's enough flowering plants at the times that the pollinators need them? What about that? And then you need to accommodate wildlife habitat or enhance wildlife habitat with grazing around maybe a nesting season or a certain amount of forage that you're limited to, or all these other special concerns come in, and this really is something that we're supposed to do in our integrative discipline of range management. This is where it all happens, but this is also where we need to start making some compromises, if you will. You can't have it all in grazing. You're trying to optimize now. You're going to give up a little bit here to gain a little bit there, trying to meet all these needs in a prescribed grazing plan. You're trying to get the happy medium, the optimization. And then, when you're done with that, the rancher says, well, that's all real nice, but I have these livestock husbandry issues, I have these logistical issues, I need to be economically viable, and it also needs to be socially acceptable. You're telling me I need to switch to goats for part of the year? I don't think that's happening. So I don't know what it is about goats, but there's a huge social thing there. I love goats, but anyway, by the time you're done making all the compromises at the end of this, and you have to get them all or this isn't going to happen at all of a sudden you can see why prescribed grazing on paper sounds so easy. All you got to do is get the timing right, and the intensity right, and the duration right, and the frequency right, and you're done. That's it. It sounds so easy on paper, but it's these kind of million things that you have to consider and work around and compromise with that makes it nearly impossible. And that is, I see it, the essence of the challenge of our work. Presentation today is going to deal down here, okay? Because if we actually can scoot some of these things up front and see them coming from a mile away, then that's going to make things go faster, go smoother. So my message is be cognizant, be aware, ask the right questions so that what you come up with doesn't blow up because of those human considerations. So there's different types of livestock enterprises. One of the first things to be cognizant of in your working with the landowner is where are you going to fit in? We've heard some of that today from some of the presenters, but within each kind of livestock operation, the details are going to be different depending on what their enterprise is. You have to know what these things are and what that's going to mean to your grazing plan. Don't forget about the custom grazing people who you're going to maybe do some prescribed grazing with someone who really doesn't own any livestock at all. That happens once in a while. So one of the things that you need to be aware of and remember is a livestock reproduction concern where you got to know when the breeding season is, if it's a cow-calf operation. Because livestock, it's better if they're concentrated in a small open pasture during breeding season. Things like heavy tall brush, rough terrain, or too large of a pasture size just makes it harder for the bulls to do their job. Okay, may or may not be a problem. If you do have those things, a little bit of a distribution problem might be a good thing to alleviate this. If you have a single shade location or a single water location where the bull can hang out and everybody's got to visit every day, then that might help this. But there might be a reason that landowner wants to be in that pasture at the same time every year. And this might be the reason. So and he might not come out and tell you this is why. Sometimes you have to ask the question. So if it is, we need to either create or find an alternative place where another breeding pasture might be, so we have choices now, so that we can accommodate the plants and can provide the rest. Okay? Another thing that comes up is some producers use artificial insemination, and if they do that, they need to be able to detect heat, which means the livestock have to be observed daily during this period of time. And they also need to be next to some working facilities. This might limit your choices on what pastures you can use during that particular time of year. Okay, these are the constraints I'm talking about. And this is where, I don't know, it's pretty easy to dismiss and say we don't build corrals for people, you know. In my state, I know we did a little bit of corral building for fixing the natural resource concern for water quality where we have a CAFO or AFO problem. But I have yet to see an example of us building a corral for somebody that helps a prescribed grazing plan get installed. But I've seen a few times where that was the constraint. We have to be in this pasture during this time every year because that's where my facilities are. Well, feasibly, how could we make the conservation happen? We could build some more facilities somewhere else so that now there's choices, so the prescribed grazing can happen. Another livestock reproduction concern. It's not always easy to move livestock during the calving or lambing season. That may or may not be a concern for your rancher. It might be really infeasible if you're wanting them to cross a river to get to a pasture on the other end of the ranch. Okay, which might have been the easy solution when you sat down and figured out what the plant needs were and how to provide rest during the growing season for all the pastures throughout the years. All of a sudden, you have to move the herd while they're calving or lambing. It's not going to happen. So, calving pastures need to have warm, sheltered, easy accessible locations where cows can be observed in case of any trouble. A loafing shed, a certain amount of brush, or we have a new practice now, don't we? In all our tech guides that we're dealing with, what's called livestock shelter structures. Okay, here you go. I can't be in that pasture during calving because there's no cover. How can we solve that problem? We can build you some cover to make that conservation happen. An example. Livestock reproduction, again, what if you've got a purebred operation or somebody that is really managing their genetics? We need, it's typical when you're designing prescribed grazing to want to combine herds into one so that we shorten the grazing time, lengthen the rest time, right? And sometimes that's not feasible just because we've got a breeding program going on. We got your group of heifers with the heifer bull and then the group of mother cows, which would be the basic one. And it just gets more complex from there. That just adds to our challenge of doing the work of how can we identify those constraints and then how can we use our conservation practices to remove those constraints, which might just mean an insane number of pastures in some cases. All operations aren't the same. So some key questions that you might want to ask a landowner and might want to remember, or if you're building a form that they fill out. I know in my state we had a time when we had an all-inclusive inventory questions form that people could fill out to get the conservation plan rolling. You might want to add things like, when is the calving or breeding season for your operation? And then you use your own knowledge of, putting the rest of the times together. Do you use artificial insemination? Where do you calve? Where do you bull up? Why do you do it there? Are there separate herds for breeding purposes? Those would be good questions to know. Livestock nutrition. Replacement heifers, if that's something that you're doing, is raising your own, or even if you're developing heifers. There are replacement heifer enterprises people do. They have additional nutritional requirements for growth above and beyond what your normal brood cow has. So maybe they need to be separated. Maybe your pasture is of good enough nutritional quality during the time that it really doesn't matter and everybody can hang together. Maybe they need to be separated just for this purpose. You have to be a little bit careful, even if the rancher isn't aware of this or doesn't think about this, and you're all proposing a new grazing management plan that might result in the forage in the pasture that you're going to be in being lower quality. This could turn out to be a disaster. So you need to bring these things up as well, so they can be thinking about them. So alternatives to deal with this could be separate pastures, or even having the brood cows follow the heifers, so the heifers get first crack at the pastures. Supplemental feed is used sometimes on rangelands to manage the body condition, to make sure they're up to enough condition for breeding when that time comes. The nutritional value of that range forage and any supplement needs that there may be, because a lot of people just guess, right? You can know precisely by using this near-infrared spectrometry analysis and the nutball software, which NRCS used to be really into, and in some places still is, but I know it's really tapered off in my state, the use of that technology. But we can sure guide landowners in that direction if supplemental feeding is something that they do, to help them decide, is this something I really need to do or not? Do you raise your own replacements? Yes or no? Do you treat them differently? Yes or no? And do you feed supplements? Are some key questions you might want to ask along these lines. Okay, livestock health. Grazing crop aftermath is a common thing that people do. Alfalfa, stubble in the fall, or a little bit of regrowth. If this is something that you're going to recommend as a new thing that's going to fit into your conservation plan, be very wary of the potential for bloat. You're going to want to not go onto those pastures until the frost has hit them and they've wilted, to really alleviate that risk of bloat. And this depends on the forage that they're coming from, of course. If you're really changing forage quality fast, it's more of an issue than if they're coming off something that's lush on alfalfa. It might not be as big a concern. Livestock health. Okay, there's issues with parasites, and especially on wet meadows, and these kind of livestock pests have a life cycle that you might want to understand if you're having wet meadows in your grazing system, in your management plan, so that your intervals and your times are set up to break those pests' life cycles. Poisonous plants comes up once in a while. Oh, did I make that too? Does anybody know that one? Golden pea, yeah. It's an Intermountain West deadly poisonous plant that grows in wetter areas. But if you have those in the pasture, the timing might be an issue. They might graze in the fall all the time because the poisonous plants aren't a problem at that time, where if you switched it to the spring, all of a sudden you can tip livestock over. So you've got to use your knowledge for that as that occurs. Some questions you might want to ask here. Do you raise your own hay or other crops? And do you graze the aftermath? Do you have parasite problems or not? Do you have poisonous plant problems or not? Just so you know up front to be on the lookout. Facilities and infrastructure. The easier the plan is to follow, the more likely it is to happen. When you're setting up your plan, try only to move to adjacent pastures. If you have to skip over 2 pastures to get to pasture 4 in your rotation, that can be a real pain in the butt to make happen. Moving cattle across roads, across railroad tracks, doing stream crossings can be barriers at certain times of the year, or might just be a pain all the time. The labor requirements can really go up if you're asking somebody to go through this. It might be just impractical. Make sure and have these discussions. The adequacy of your existing facilities like fences and troughs and corrals should be considered real careful before you even start your plan. And by adequacy, just not the number of them, but I know in Utah there's been several instances where you know, a large pasture with really low stock density that was grazed for a long time might have had an old bathtub with a little spring development that just trickled in, and it was fine. It was fine. That worked great. But when we started changing things and made the pasture smaller or the herd size bigger, even though you're there for a shorter amount of time, even though the same amount of forage is being removed, your stock water requirements went up. And all of a sudden the little bathtub with the trickle in spring development is not cutting it anymore. So watch that. You not only have to have the right size, you have to have the right flow of water for the number of livestock that's going to be there, or enough storage. You got to solve that problem somehow. Livestock marketing. The shorter the distance between the gathering pasture and the shipping corrals, the less shrink the rancher has to endure on the sale of the animals. You know what shrink is? Who can tell me?
Loss of weight from water usually.
Loss of weight from stress or working them, or you know, being held in the corral for a long time without water or whatever. It can be significant. It can be, you know, pushing up, I don't know, 6% or more on the weight. That's a lot. If you're asking them to, okay, when you gather in the fall, bring them a really long ways to your shipping corrals, you're asking them to take a big bite out of their paycheck. Facilities and infrastructure. The pastures, proximity corrals, and working facilities is critical during any time those livestock have to be worked. You have to be cognizant of what kind of operation it is and what they might be doing throughout the year. Are they doing artificial insemination, pregnancy checking, shipping and receiving when you're coming on and off, when it's time to go to the sale, when do you do vaccination and any other branding or what have you? When are you doing those things? Where's your facilities for doing those things? And how can we make sure that fits into the grazing plan? You're going to run into a lot of problems when you consider all these things on a ranch. And you're going to learn why sometimes the pattern of grazing that's being adhered to now is happening. It's because they're trying to accommodate these things. And to me, our job is, you got to think this way, identify those constraints, and figure out how you can remove them. Figure out how to break down those walls so that now there is choice on whether I graze this pasture or that pasture. Okay? Lifestyle constraints. Livestock producers are a pretty diverse group. As we've heard today, a lot of them, most of them work off farm. There's a lot of absentee owners, and if you have too many pastures and too many moving dates and this is too complicated, this is a big reason that continuous grazing happens right here, is people don't have time to put into their operations. Make sure you get a feel for that up front before you start proposing things, and try to think of a way to make it easy. So if we're cognizant of those ranching, logistic, animal husbandry kind of things from the beginning of the inventory until the final plan, the result is going to be what? More likely to happen. It's going to be more likely to go on the ground. With that, I am interested to hear people's experiences and constraints that you might have encountered when planning prescribed grazing. All right.